Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Leveraging Lessons from the Past webinar. Today's topic is on what's quality and regulatory for 2024. This is Heidi Zumker, an Education Program Manager for Clinic Laboratories. Our presenters today are Shannon Bennett, Director of Regulatory Affairs, and Jennifer Nosbish, CLIA Compliance Program Manager, both at Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. Just a couple of things to remind everyone before we begin today. There will be a question and answer session at the end of the program. You can submit questions online via the Q&A icon on Zoom. Please only use the chat function for any technical issues. Today's program is being recorded and will be posted to our website in a few weeks. And now I'll turn our things over to our presenters.
Welcome to our webinar. I'll start off here with our disclosures. This is our disclosure slide. We have nothing to disclose, no off-label use, no relevant financial information. Next slide. I'll start by going over our objectives. The first objective for today's webinar is to evaluate current operations to determine if impacted by recent CMS CLIA operational updates. And our second objective is to paraphrase updates to CLIA regulations impacting CLIAs, histocompatibility, personnel, and alternative sanctions. The third objective is to identify proficiency testing, PT regulations, and our fourth objective is to assess potential compliance gaps for FDA LDT regulations. I'll start off sharing a few CLIA operational updates. There's been quite a few lately, so I think it's important to pick up on. One recent update is the option to sign up to receive electronic notifications from CMS. If you have opted in to receive email notifications, your CLIA certificate, your CLIA invoices, or as they call them, your CLIA fee coupons, and any loss of accreditation warning letters will now come to you as a link via email. You will receive a link via an email from CMS, and the link will take you to either your certificate, your invoice, or your fee coupon, or your loss of accreditation warning letter. If you choose, you can then print any of those copies for your own records. Also, if you have opted in for electronic notification, be aware that as of the end of August, CMS has stopped sending hard copies to the U.S. mail. Loss of accreditation warning letters, they're sent when a certificate of accreditation lab loses its accreditation voluntarily or non-voluntarily, and the warning letter includes information on steps the lab should take to stay certified by CLIA. Also, if you have not signed up for electronic notifications and are still receiving hard copies, be aware that CMS is no longer sending 3 CLIA invoices or fee coupons prior to the final payment due date. They're now only sending 2 invoices. Next slide. You also have a demographic lookup option out on the CMS CLIA website. You can search lab director name or zip code. This lookup allows you to see the latest information on your CLIA certificate and will also give you a link from which you can print a copy of your CLIA certificate. Whether you're receiving your notifications electronically or by hard copy, this search function, this demographic lookup and print functionality is available to you. Next slide, please. This slide shows a couple of examples. The example on the left has a link where you can print the CLIA certificate, the blue link on the bottom. The example on the right doesn't have the link yet. The ability to print appears to be kind of a slow rollout. I also want to point out that this link will show the most recent issued CLIA certificate. So if you click on that link, it would be just the most recent CLIA certificate information, but it may not show the most current lab information. So for example, as you look at the slide, you can see the information says 3050 Superior Drive Northwest, which is accurate as of today. But if, let's say, we change the location of it, the certificate itself, that if you went to print the certificate, it may still have the old address. So if a lab updates its address, the lookup may show the current address, while the certificate from that link may reflect the old address. You'll see that discrepancy, so just be aware of that. The new changes are updated on the next issued certificate, so the next cycle for certificate. Next slide, please. I mentioned this earlier, but wanted to call it out so it doesn't get missed. If you're still receiving hard copies of CLIA invoices, be aware that CMS is only going to send 2 invoices prior to payment date. In the past, CMS has always sent 3 invoices, but has recently reduced that down to 2. The original invoice will say certificate fee. See where I have it circled red? It will just say certificate fee. And the second notice will be what they call a rebill certificate fee. So that's why I have it circled. This is the second notification on this one. Another new option offered by CMS is the option to pay CLIA certificate fees online through a secure form hosted by the Treasury Department. This process was implemented a couple of years ago, but I'd like to point it out because it's a great updated process for labs to use. You can pay with a credit card or a bank account number. You can have it routed that way as well. The online payments are processed overnight, which is much faster than sending the hard copies for payment. You can use this for your regular payment process, or you can use it in those oh no situations where an invoice gets missed or you need a CLIA certificate in a hurry. Those types of situations, it's a great process for those things. The website is www.pay.gov, and in the search, just type in CLIA and you'll see CLIA laboratory user fees and just click continue and you're on your way. The key takeaway though is to make sure you're on the .gov website. Next slide, please. Next, I want to share with you updates from the December 2023 CLIA final rule on fees. Histocompatibility, personnel, and alternative sanctions for certificate of waiver labs. I'll start by sharing 2 new definitions. The first is a replacement certificate, which means an active CLIA certificate that is reissued with no changes made. That's a replacement certificate. The second new definition is revised certificate, which is defined as an active CLIA certificate that is reissued with changes to one or more field displayed on the certificate, such as the laboratory's name, the address, lab director, approved specialties or subspecialties. For purposes of this part, revised certificates do not include the issuance, renewal, change in certificate type, or reinstatement of a terminated certificate when there's a gap in service. So two new definitions related to CLIA certificates. Next slide, please. The first big bucket item in the final rule covers CLIA fees. CLIA establishes 2 types of fees. There's certificate fees and additional fees. Historically, CMS has not used its authority to collect these fees, but will begin to now, these additional fees. Fees will now be assessed in 5 new situations. Those situations are 1, follow-up surveys to confirm deficiencies have been corrected. The second one is for reviewing and approving testing when adding a specialty or subspecialty to an existing CLIA certificate. The third is for complete surveys when findings are substantiated. The fourth is for desk reviews involving unsuccessful proficiency testing. And the fifth new fee for issuing a revised or replacement certificate. In addition, the final rule increased the cost of a certificate of a waiver by $25, just kind of an across the board increase there. And they also imposed an 18% increase across the board on all CLIA certificate types. And they also instituted a biennial 2-part increase of CLIA fees based on the Consumer Price Index. So right away, we saw the 18% across the board fees go up, and then there will be a biennial increase based on a calculation in the future. A certificate fee occurs when the original certificate is issued, when the certificate is renewed and there's a change in the certificate type, or if a lapsed certificate is reactivated with a gap service. The CLIA program is user fee funded, and per CMS, the final rule implements the process to make sure it's sustainable for the CLIA program. Next slide. This slide The chart on this slide shows the updated fees by the CLIA certificate type. Next slide. Okay, the next big bucket in this final rule was regarding histocompatibility. The histocompatibility specialty, and they really amended the histocompatibility regulations to address obsolete regulations and update regulations and incorporate changes in technology. This slide shows some of the changes in histocompatibility. According to CMS, only a small number of laboratories are impacted by these changes. As of January 2023, to CMS, they say there's only 247 labs that perform histocompatibility testing. That's a small number compared to the roughly 32,000 labs with the CLIA certificate of compliance or accreditation. So I'll cover some changes at a high level, but if you're one of the approximately 250 labs impacted by these changes, please take a closer look at these. CLIA histocompatibility regulations had not been updated since 1992, so they had a lot to update just from a technology perspective. This rule removed histocompatibility specific requirements at 493.1278 that were already addressed by the general quality control requirements for all testing systems in regular CLIA regulations. So they updated those, got rid of some obsoleted things or duplicative stuff. It also addressed recommendations provided by CLIA. And just as a reminder, CLIA is the Clinical Laboratory Improvement Advisory Committee, and they are responsible, they provide guidance to the Department of Health and Human Services, directly impacting CLIA and other organizations. Next slide, please. They added a requirement to collect a recipient specimen on the day of the transplant or prior to transplantation, if possible. And if the lab is unable to obtain, the lab must document the efforts taken to obtain the specimen. They also amended 493.1278A1 by changing the words an audible alarm system. They changed to say a continuous monitoring and alarm system. Next slide, please. They revised the words transfusion to transfuse and infusion to infuse for clarification purposes. They revised the name of 493.1278D from antibody screening to antibody screening and identification, again for clarification. They added allele. I gave you a few highlights of the changes impacting histocompatibility, and again, the slides have additional detail. And I recommend any lab with a histocompatibility specialty review the changes in the final rule. Next slide. These changes cover cross-matching and transplantations, and they're meant to add more flexibility per CMS. CMS removed duplicative requirements. They clarified the requirements for a pre- and post-transplant confirmation testing of the donors and recipients, and they defined time limits between recipient testing and performance of cross-match. Next slide, please. The next big bucket addressed in the final rule covers personnel. Again, this section went through extensive updates, so please review the section in more detail and specifics that could impact your labs. All of our labs are a little bit different. So personnel changes take effect in December of 2024. So I want to start by going over 5 new definitions. The first definition is mid-level practitioner. The current definition for mid-level practitioner was amended to add a nurse anesthetist and clinical nurse specialist. So the full definition now includes a nurse midwife, nurse practitioner, physician assistant, nurse anesthetist, and clinical nurse specialist, licensed by the state which the individual practices, if such licensing is required, in the state in which the laboratory is located. The definition is for experience directing or supervising, which means the directing or supervising experience must be obtained in a facility that meets the definition of a laboratory under 493.2, so the CLIA definition of a laboratory, and is not accepted under 493.3. And then the third definition is continuing education credit hours. And that is defined to mean either continuing medical education or CME, or continued education, which are CE units. This final rule also clarified that 20 CEs must be obtained before qualifying an individual as a lab director, CLIA lab director, for moderate and high complexity testing. Next slide, please. The fourth new definition is for doctoral degree. A doctoral degree is defined as an earned post-baccalaureate degree with at least 3 years of graduate level study that includes research related to clinical lab testing or advanced study in clinical lab science, medical lab science, or medical technology. They clarify that MDs and DOs are not the same as a non-medical doctoral degree. So doctoral degrees do not include MDs and DOs or a doctor of podiatry or honorary degrees. An MD and DOs must continue to qualify under the applicable CLIA personnel requirements for MDs and DOs. And individuals with non-medical doctoral degrees must qualify under the doctoral degree requirements. So doctoral degrees are not just limited to PhD degrees. So a Doctor of Clinical Lab Science degree would be included in the definition of a doctoral degree. And the fifth new definition is for laboratory training or experience. And that is laboratory training or experience means the training or experience must be obtained in a facility that meets that definition of a laboratory. Individuals must obtain independently generated documentation, so not from a CV of training or experience. And lab experience with non-human specimens isn't acceptable. And the experience from facilities performing testing on human specimens that are not reported the patient-specific results, or they report aggregate results, or testing only for forensic purposes also don't count. They called those things out too. So next slide, please. This slide covers PPM lab director responsibilities. The final rule clarified that competency assessment applies to PPM testing. The final rule modified the PPM laboratory director responsibilities at 493.1359 to include competency assessment. They're responsible for competency assessment. So PPM lab director's responsibility for evaluating the competency of all testing personnel. It also clarified that a PPM lab is expected to follow the same competency assessment intervals as moderate and high complexity labs, which means semi-annually that first year and then yearly thereafter. An employee is hired or testing personnel is hired. If a CLIA certificate of compliance or a CLIA certificate of accreditation lab performs PPM procedures under the certificate of compliance or certificate of accreditation, then the lab is subject to all CLIA regulations related to the moderate complexity testing. So that includes delegating the performance of competency assessment to a technical consultant. However, in a lab with just a PPM CLIA certificate, it's again the lab director's responsibility to perform the competency assessment. There's no delegation at that point. Next slide, please. This is updates to lab director qualifications and responsibilities for both moderate and high complexity testing. The final rule removed the words, and this is in quotes, or possesses qualifications that are equivalent to those required for such certification. So previously, an individual could meet the certificate requirements or the qualification, lab director qualification requirements if they possess the qualifications to become certified, but weren't certified yet, didn't have that board certification. this rule changes that. It removed those wordings of being equivalent to the required certification. It also includes the 20 continuous education hours, as I mentioned earlier, for the moderate and high complexity lab directors, and also removed the residency provision. However, the relevant experience in a residency or fellowship could continue to be acceptable experience if it's clinical laboratory training. It goes back to those definitions. Next slide, please. Laboratory directors must be on site at least once every 6 months, with at least a 4-month gap between those 2 visits. On-site visits must be documented, and this documentation must include evidence of performing activities that are part of the lab director's responsibility. So those are new. Doctoral degrees, they again revised that language in the regulations to specify that the doctoral degree must be an earned doctoral degree, no honorary degrees. Next slide, please. Technical supervisor qualifications. Regarding technical supervisor qualifications, the final rule redesigned the paragraphs for simplicity and to help reduce some confusion in these sections here. They grouped identical technical supervisor requirements into a combined provision. They also removed any reference to the American Society of Cytology, as they haven't provided certification for cytology since 1998, so they removed that. They also updated the education qualification requirements for immunohematology specialty to all individuals with doctoral, master's, or bachelor's degrees with appropriate training and experience to qualify as a technical supervisor. Next slide, please. Testing personnel. Nursing degrees. Individuals with nursing degrees will only be able to qualify when the nursing degree is specifically listed in the regulatory qualifications. So nursing degrees will qualify under moderate complexity testing personnel. However, individuals with nursing degrees will not qualify as high complexity testing personnel. All individuals, including those with nursing degrees who are currently in positions listed in subpart M, so any of the positions listed in CLIA, prior to the effective date of the final rule, are grandfathered as long as they meet the applicable grandfathering provision, including continuous employment in the position since the effective date of the final rule. So be aware of that. Next slide, please. Wrapping up personnel here. CMS clarified that lab experience needs to be clinical in nature. I mentioned that a little bit ago. They also removed all reference to physical science degrees and changed terminology from medical technology to clinical lab science and medical lab science. Next slide, please. So flipping over now to moving from personnel over to alternative sanctions. Prior to this final rule, the CLIA regulations didn't allow alternative sanctions for certificate of waiver labs because those labs were not inspected through the biannual routine surveys for compliance to condition level requirements. However, as we know, certificate of waiver labs are surveyed as a result of a complaint. And based on the complaint survey, they may be found out to be out of compliance with the condition level requirement during those complaint surveys. This final rule changed this, so CMS is now allowed to impose alternative sanctions such as civil money penalties, a directed plan of correction, or on-site state monitoring in addition to or in lieu of principal sanctions. So they just reworded it so those alternative sanctions are also an option for them. Next slide, please. Okay, just to wrap this up, I just want to point out that when CMS published the final rule on December 28th of 2023 of last year, they also published a corrected document in the first part of this year. It just had a few minor revisions, nothing really in the technical field. It was more typos and corrections like that, things that were missing, but nothing technically. So just be aware there are a couple different documents with different dates on it. There are two effective dates to be aware of. The fees, CLIA fees, and alternative sanction changes, as well as the definitions for replacement certificate and revised certificate already took effect. They took effect in January 27th of this year. The histocompatibility and personnel changes and remaining new definitions will take effect December 28th of this year. Next slide, please. I'm going to turn this over to Shannon for proficiency testing updates.
Great, thanks for all those updates, Jenny. So first, I'm going to touch briefly on some updated proficiency testing regulations. In background, the proficiency testing rules, of course, were part of CLIA when originally implemented in the early 90s, and there really haven't been any update to those PT rules in the last 30 or so years. So there are now new rules that will be fully implemented as of January 1st of this coming year. So to go over some of the high-level updates, firstly, for bacteriology, mycobacteriology, and mycology, the requirements for mixed culture samples has been reduced from 50% to 25%. They've moved to percentage-based limits rather than standard deviations, but for lower concentrations, they're also using fixed concentration units to address that. So for example, if you have a bilirubin assay, the acceptable performance might be plus or minus 20%, but at the low end, it would be plus or minus 0.4 milligrams per deciliter. So that's a good change. In microbiology, a major change here is rather than a laundry list of organisms, they've instead replaced it with categories. So in bacteriology, as you might expect, there will be gram-positive and gram-negative bacilli and cocci with direct antigen detection, toxin detection, with or without identification, and antimicrobial susceptibility on some of the challenges. And then for the other categories within microbiology, very similar, where you'll have detection with or without identification using appropriate methods. For non-microbiology, they remove a number of analytes. These are analytes that are no longer widely used. And then they added a number of analytes that have been put into common practice. So in toxicology and general immunology, there are a handful, and endocrinology and routine chemistry, there's a longer list. I won't go through all of these, they're in the slides. Please feel free to reference them. Moving on to the FDA LDT rule. So I think at this point, everyone is aware that in May of this year, FDA released new regulations where they now consider laboratory developed tests to be medical devices. And just to refresh everyone's memory, there is a 4-year implementation timeline for phasing in these requirements based upon the publication date of the final rule. So in May of 2025, milestone 1, laboratories will need to begin medical device reporting or adverse event reporting, as well as complaint handling. By year 2, so May of 2026, laboratories will need to register as medical device manufacturers and list information about their tests, including labeling. We'll get into that here in a minute. Now, if you want to continue offering laboratory developed tests at all, you will need to comply with these first 2 milestones. So if you have any LDTs whatsoever that you're going to continue to offer after May of 2026, you will need to meet these first 2. Year 3 are select quality system requirements. If you are a laboratory that is submitting your LDTs to New York State for approval, or if you are modifying your own previously offered tests or modifying test kits from a commercial manufacturer, you will need to meet milestone 3. And if your tests, if your LDTs don't fall into an enforcement discretion category, then you will potentially need to be submitting your LDTs to the FDA in either November of 2027 for high-risk tests or May of 2028 for everything else. So let's dive into the first 2 milestones a little bit. So milestone 1 is adverse event reporting and complaint handling, as I mentioned. And so FDA refers to this as medical device reporting. So this is when a laboratory becomes aware of an event that reasonably suggests an LDT may have caused or contributed to death or serious injury, or the LDT has malfunctioned and would be likely to cause or contribute to death or serious injury if the malfunction were to recur. So let's break this down a little bit. What do we mean by becomes aware? This essentially means that the laboratory acquired some information that there's been an event and their LDT may have been involved in it. And this can happen through a number of mechanisms. You can have some kind of a non-conformance, calibration failure, a QC failure. You could receive a complaint. All of these would constitute becoming aware. And that is important, as we'll get to in a little bit, because that's when the clock starts. So they would expect, if we need to report to them, that we do it in a certain period of time. And so as soon as we become aware, that's when the clock starts. Reasonably suggest means a reasonable person could draw a practical association between the LDT and harm. So if someone calls in and complains about the paint color in your collection area, that is a complaint, but obviously not related to the LDT, obviously not related to any sort of patient harm. So a reasonable person would not draw the conclusion that there's something wrong with the LDT. All right, now what about death or serious injury? Death is fairly self-explanatory. What do we mean by serious injury? So this is the patient has suffered a permanent impairment due to an inaccurate result from your LDT, or they required medical intervention to prevent permanent impairment. So that is death or serious injury. Next, we have a malfunction. What is a malfunction? Again, this could be a number of things. This could be a performance failure, some sort of out of specification, or the test did not meet its claims. So on that last one, for example, if in our test catalog, we claim that our test can measure down to 1.0, but we routinely get inaccurate results at that level. So maybe we have false positives or false negatives. That would be a situation where a test is not meeting its claim, and that may be reportable if that led to death or serious injury of a patient. So here's how I envision this going in the laboratory. So there's some sort of an out of specification issue. So maybe the assay failed, QC failure, calibration failure, whatever the case may be, or a potentially inaccurate result is reported to the laboratory by a physician or a patient. So as always, a laboratory will investigate as we do today. However, we'll have some additional questions that we'll need to ask now. So first, did the issue cause or contribute to patient harm? And again, that would be death, long-term injury, or unnecessary treatment, or some sort of medical intervention. Now, if we caught the issue before reporting out a result, so we had a QC failure and we reran the batch, that most likely would not have caused or contributed to patient harm because we didn't report anything out. That one is fairly straightforward. However, what happens if that issue could recur in the future? Would that be considered a malfunction? This gets trickier because it's very easy for laboratorians to talk themselves into thinking that this could be, eventually a serious result if it wasn't caught. So we had a QC failure that we didn't catch. We reported out a result. The physician misinterpreted it or didn't interpret it in the context of other results. And the patient could possibly maybe be harmed. It's very easy to talk yourself into that. So I think the important thing here will be to develop standards and guidance within your laboratory to clearly identify how you will assign risk to different events, just to kind of help guide you to what would be FDA reportable and what would not be FDA reportable. And of course, for all of this investigation, it will require significant documentation. And I think that's a broad statement for these new FDA regulations across the board, that laboratories will need to do a lot more documentation. If you determine that a medical device report is required, so you do need to report to the FDA, that has to happen within 30 days, and that's 30 days of becoming aware. So that's where that time frame becomes very important. And so that's not a lot of time to do a deep dive into identifying what is the root cause, what happened, how do we prevent it from happening again, and that sort of thing. Now, the good news is most likely your laboratory already has some sort of adverse event or non-conforming event management process. You will likely need to expand upon it, but you have something to start with. The piece of milestone one that I'm a little more concerned about is around complaints. So a complaint is any written, electronic, or oral communication that alleges a deficiency with the LDT. So someone complaining that they think they got an inaccurate result, someone calling to complain they don't think the test incorporates certain elements that it should, certain markers or things like that. So a couple of kind of general statements here is complaints need to be received, reviewed, and evaluated by a designated team in a standardized way. This is right out of the regulations. So your laboratory will need to designate a group of people that receive and evaluate complaints, and they do so in a standardized way. So you'll need, processes and procedures and so on. Now, complaints is actually a two-step process. We receive the complaint. We need to decide, first of all, if we need to investigate further. If we don't need to investigate further, we need to document that. Why did we decide an investigation is not required, and who made that decision? If we do need to investigate, then it's possible that could eventually turn into a MDR, a medical device report. So complaints and MDR are very closely linked. If there is a problem, or if there's a complaint that involves possible LDT failure or some sort of a labeling issue or concern, we'll talk about labeling here in a second, then you must investigate and, of course, document that investigation. So I think oftentimes today, I think labs, we do receive complaints. We will look into them, we'll address them, and we'll move on with our lives. Now, in an FDA world, we'll need to do, again, significantly more documentation of these things on how we addressed the complaint. So complaint files are fairly involved. So there's a lot of documentation required. So first of all, we'll need the test name and test identifier. That might be an order code or however you definitively identify your tests, the date of the complaint, who complained, and the details of their complaint. And then if an investigation is further required, the dates and results of that investigation. So who you talked to, when you talked to them, what you learned, etc. What corrective action was taken, and then finally, any response to the complainant. And all this needs to be documented, and all of it needs to be readily available. So if FDA asks for information about a particular complaint, you can quickly provide it. So you'll need a complaint file to document all this information. Moving on to milestone 2 with registration and listing. So laboratories start in 2026 will need to register as medical device manufacturers. There is an annual fee for that. It's about $9,300 in 2025. And that fee does go up every year, so it will continue to climb. There is a small business fee that is less than that. So if you are a small laboratory, that might be something worth looking into. Listing is straightforward. It's your test name, company name and address, name of the owner, and name of an official correspondent. Labeling is where things get a little more complicated. So laboratories will be required to provide labeling on all of their LDTs, which includes performance information and a summary of supporting validation. So let's dive into that a little bit more. I will note that FDA recently did give a webinar a couple weeks ago on labeling, where they included a lot of really good examples. So I would highly encourage you to go out and, if nothing else, download the slides that they provided. If you Google FDA LDT labeling webinar, you should be able to find it pretty quickly. Otherwise, just leave your information in the comments and I'd be happy to point you in the right direction. But labeling is involved. So test name, obviously. Intended use would include things like, what is the analyte? Is this a quantitative or a qualitative test? What is the patient population you're interested in? A summary and explanation of the test. This is where you put your method description, as well as the benefits of the test and any potential limitations of the test. Principles would be the chemical reactions involved, the techniques involved. Reagent information itself is so this would include the name and concentration of the reagents, manufacturer, catalog number, constitution instructions, storage information, quite lengthy. Along those same lines, instrument information is also quite involved. So performance specifications of instrumentation used, operating instructions, calibration, QC, precautions, maintenance information. So a lot of documentation here. Specimen collection, we're all quite familiar with. So what is the specimen type? Where the collection device is used? Is there any sort of patient preparation required, such as fasting? And then stability information for the specimen. Procedure information is a little bit interesting, and that's what the asterisk is for. So we will need to include high-level procedural steps for the test. It doesn't need to be every single detailed step. That can be non-information in your laboratory's SOPs, but in the facing labeling information, you will need at least the high-level procedural steps for the LDT. Results. So the expected results, but this also includes any calculations used to arrive at those results if it's a quantitative assay. And you need to include a step-by-step example of how those calculations are used. Limitations would be things like inappropriate populations. So if your test is not intended for pediatric patients, for example, that might be an indication. Any interfering substances. And if there is a need for potential confirmatory testing, that would also potentially go in the limitations section. Expected values would be your reference range or reference interval. And then performance characteristics would be precision, accuracy, reference range, reportal range, etc. So labeling is very involved. The good news is you likely have most or all of this information. The bad news is it's probably scattered in a lot of different locations. And so I think the effort here will be around gathering the information, putting it in the appropriate format, in the appropriate order, and making it publicly available. And not only do you need to provide that information to the FDA, but if you make modifications to your test, or if you clarify something like your intended use, add additional information, those updates also need to go to the FDA's updated link. So for laboratories with large menus, this is likely going to be a fairly significant clerical lift for laboratories to gather all this information. All right. At this point, Jenny and I are happy to entertain any questions you might have. Jenny, we got a couple for you right off the bat. The first is, has anyone encountered a CLIA certificate not showing specialty subspecialties?
Okay, thanks, Shannon. No, unless it's a certificate of waiver will not have anything on there from a specialty or subspecialty. But as far as any other type of certificate, no, it's on there.
Okay, very good. And next is, could you please clarify what a degree is? Is that a 2-year undergraduate degree or a 4-year degree?
Great question. That is a great question. So if we go back to how this all came out, back in 2018, I think it was, roughly around there, it was pre-pandemic. They did an RFI, request for information, where they asked specific questions related to CLIA, and one of those was related to nursing degrees. And at that point, they were talking about bachelor's in nursing because they were talking about adding, making it a nursing degree qualify for high complexity testing. So now that that's changed a little bit, really don't know. Just says nursing degrees. So I'm kind of assuming, I don't know. I don't know. I think we'll have to see what happens in December, what it's, what the actual wording is in the regulations. When it didn't clarify.
Yeah,
great question though.
Devils are definitely in the details.
Absolutely.
All right, well, if you have other questions related to CLIA updates, FDA updates, please feel free to put them into the Q&A section. I'll vamp for time here just a little bit. It's a very unsettled regulatory environment right now for labs. There's a lot going on. You have the FDA, you have these CLIA changes. There continues to be discussion around PAMA and reimbursement reform. The lab industry did manage to get another 1-year extension to PAMA payment cuts, but that will be a continuing topic area for us to ensure that we aren't facing draconian cuts. So I know it can be a little tiring and exhausting sometimes, but it's really important, to continue educating yourself and staying on top of all the changes that are coming labs' way. Jenny, another one for you. When discussing PPM certificate laboratory director responsibility changes, does the laboratory director have to personally conduct competency assessment for testing personnel?
That's the way it is sounding in the final rule. Correct. Now, of course, again, devil's in the details, so we'll have to see what actually comes out in those regulations come December, but that's exactly what they're saying and sounding like in the final rule.
So just to state it another way, so that is not something that could be delegated.
Not unless, so not if you're working underneath a CLIA, PPM CLIA certificate. If you're working under a certificate of compliance or a certificate of accreditation, then it could be delegated. And the difference in those is that a PPM certificate doesn't have a technical supervisor.
All right, and a couple FDA related ones. So has the FDA defined what a modification is? Does this encompass using a different specimen, such as a manufacturer, where a manufacturer says you have to use serum and you validate plasma? Great question. So FDA has identified modifications that are significant, that's my word, significant enough that they would require an FDA submission, and modifications that would not require an FDA submission as long as you're meeting other requirements. Let me back the timeline. Okay, so as long as you are compliant with milestones 1, 2, and 3, so you're reporting your adverse events, you're registered and listed, and you are using these select quality system elements like design controls, you can modify your own previously offered tests. Some people refer to these as grandfathered tests, so tests available prior to May 6th. And you can also modify a manufacturer's commercial kit that you purchase from your favorite manufacturer. And I think this is really the example here, where the kit says serum and you validated plasma. Those do not require a submission to FDA unless you are making one of 4 types of changes that FDA calls out. So for example, if you are changing the intended use of the kit, so the kit is for cancer detection and you're using it for an Alzheimer's test, that would require submission. If you are swapping out a major reagent, that would require an FDA submission. If you're adding a new technology, so that might be adding in AI, or this was important, automating a manual step, those would be a significant change that would require an FDA submission. And then finally, if your change negatively impacts the performance of the test, that would require an FDA submission. So they don't necessarily define a modification per se. It's really any change to a test. But what they do define is those modifications that are so significant that they would require a submission to the FDA. And then the next question is just a clarification. Is labeling required in 25 or 26? So labeling occurs on the May 2026 milestone 2 with registration and listing. That's when laboratories will need to submit all of that labeling information that I talked about. Is the LDT fee assessed per LDT on your test list? No. So the registration fee is for your laboratory, your facility. So you are registering as a medical device manufacturer, and the fee for that is about $9,300 per year. The one thing that we'll need to keep in mind is we don't yet know how FDA is going to handle this. Is it going to be per corporate entity, or is it going to be per CLIA number? Because there are quite a few labs, particularly large multi-state health systems, that have numerous CLIAs. We don't know how FDA is going to handle that yet. They do have a webinar coming up in December 4th, I believe, where they are going to talk about registration and listing. So I think that will be an important one to listen in on, and hopefully we'll get more guidance on how exactly FDA is thinking when it comes to registration of larger laboratories with multiple CLIAs. Will we know before May 2025 if the FDA will be allowed to continue their new LDT enforcement? So that's a good question. I think the short answer is, I don't know. So there's a lot of things in flight right now. So we do have a presidential election coming up in a couple of weeks. Feels like a couple years, but it's a couple weeks. Republican administrations tend to be more skeptical of greater regulation. Democratic administrations tend to be more supportive of greater regulation. So depending on which party is in the White House, that could impact this. Congress continues talking about a legislative approach rather than FDA's regulatory approach. So something could come out of that. I don't think we'll see that this year, maybe next year. And of course, there are a couple of lawsuits right now challenging FDA's authority. There may be a decision on those, first half of next year. However, there will certainly be an appeal regardless of who wins. So there is a lot of uncertainty right now, and I don't know when things will settle down. So it's just, again, stay in tune with what's going on in the industry, what's going on with the regulations, and educate as much as possible. As part of the LDT regulations, is there something that the test cannot be marketed for outreach clients, or did I read that incorrectly? You are correct. So the regulations treat LDTs as medical devices, which typically require pre-market review and approval by the FDA. However, in the final rule, they did include a number of what they call enforcement discretion categories. So on a targeted test-by-test basis, FDA may allow laboratories to not necessarily follow all of these requirements. So for example, the New York State approval is an enforcement discretion category where as long as you're approved by New York and meet milestones 1, 2, and 3, you don't need to submit to FDA for review. Okay. Those categories is a laboratory associated with a healthcare system that is offering an LDT that addresses an unmet need. So there are no FDA authorized tests on the market for that particular animal and disease state, and is only offered to their internal patients. So if you are using that enforcement discretion category to avoid submitting to FDA, part of that is your test can only be ordered by your hospital's physicians and performed on patients at your hospital, which means, correct, if you're using that enforcement discretion category, you would not be able to offer your testing on an outreach or referral basis. If you did that, it would kick you out of qualifying for that enforcement discretion category, and you would either need to meet one of the other enforcement discretion categories or have to submit your test to FDA. Good question. All right, I'm not seeing any additional questions. So on behalf of Jenny and I and the MCL education team, thank you all very much for attending today. And I'm sure we will be talking about some of these topics for a while yet. So keep your ears open.
Yes, thanks, Shannon and Jenny. If you did have additional questions, please feel free to include those in your evaluation and reference this link that was just put in the chat. As a reminder, this program was recorded and will be archived on our website in a few weeks. Laboratory credit is extended for this program, so upon finalizing your evaluation, you'll have the option to claim credit and print your certificate. Thanks again for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you for participating. Please click the button below to complete the evaluation and obtain credit.